Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Linnean Society of London. Although we're not in our rooms in Burlington House, we can all feel that we're together here virtually. Now, those of you who are not fellows of the Society may not know about us, so I'll tell you just a little bit about the Society. We're the oldest society devoted to natural history in the world, and we welcome people as fellows who are enthusiasts and passionate about the natural world. You don't have to be an academic to be a fellow of the Linnean Society of London. So anyone who's not a fellow of the Society, please do consider becoming a fellow. We have a great program of events and things going on, and wonderful programs from education, heritage, science, the whole gamut. And we really welcome people to become fellows and participate in helping us to kind of achieve our vision and our mission. And now we move to our speaker for this evening, Professor Annette Broderick, who's a professor of marine conservation at the University of Exeter. She's a member of the IUCN Marine Turtle Specialist Group and is currently leading the red listing assessment for the green turtle. Annette's research focuses on the exploitation and status of marine vertebrates, especially turtles. She'll talk to us tonight about her long-term research in two very different parts of the world and provide an overview of the predicted impacts of climate change on marine turtles and explore how these amazing creatures may be adapting to the changing climate, drawing on the research she's conducted at Ascension Island and Cyprus, where she's been doing research for more than 20 years. Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us tonight, Annette. And now over to you and the turtles.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
Yes, all good.
Great, thank you. So I'm beaming over the waves to you tonight from Cornwall, where I'm based at the Centre for Ecology and Conservation. And that's part of the University of Exeter. We have two campuses down in Cornwall, in Truro and Penryn, the latter where I'm based. What I'm showing you here on your screen you've been looking at is a green turtle nesting on Ascension Island on one of the beaches called Long Beach. It's not usual for green turtles to be nesting in the daytime. Some species of turtle do nest in the daytime, but opportunistically, turtles are often still on the beach in the morning, covering over their nests, and a great photo opportunity. So as Sandy mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you tonight about two study systems. One on Ascension Island, so on the left here you're seeing green turtle hatchlings, and that work goes on with the Ascension Island government. On the right you're seeing a loggerhead female nesting turtle, and that work is going to be conducted in Cyprus, and that work is with the Society for the Protection of Turtles in Northern Cyprus. I would just add now that all of the papers that I'm going to be referring to through the talk today are also available on the website given here below if you would like more information. And I think it's really interesting to find out how people ended up where they got to, especially for those coming up through the ranks. So I thought I'd start off with that this evening. I'm pictured here on the left, and I was very lucky to study zoology at the University of Glasgow. And as part of the connections with staff there and others in Trinidad, we were lucky enough to go on a sort of student expedition as undergraduates to study the leatherback turtles nesting there. So I was really fortunate that leatherback turtles were the first turtle that I encountered, because they are the most magnificent prehistoric beasts. Through the experiences gained there and through a weird connection with another member of staff at the University of Glasgow, this wonderful gentleman invited us out to Northern Cyprus to help start up the monitoring and conservation programme there. This is Kutlay Saliolo, also known as Ketcher, and he's a Turkish Cypriot who had noticed over the years the numbers of turtles around Cyprus declining and development happening and loss of habitat. And so he was really keen for something to be done. So he invited a group of us to go out there, a group of students to go out, his soldiers, his manpower, he used to call us. And that was in 1992, and so we've been going back ever since, and this has become really one of the platforms for my research career. I was really fortunate to have this opportunity to start something and to kind of have ownership, I guess, of a field studies site. And more nowadays we work with the Turkish Cypriot students and other staff out there who are resident there and who work with us on the project. So I'm going to be talking about climate change tonight, and specifically all of the impacts that happen to our ocean systems. And we know that temperature is really important, and the changes in temperature have been quite dramatic over the years, but we also know we've got challenges with increasing acidity, storminess, sea level rise, and changes to ocean currents. The latter perhaps one of the really hard things to predict what might happen. And one of the stark statistics, I think, because I love coral reef systems, is that with just 2 degrees centigrade warming, 99% of our coral reefs will decline, and that's really quite dramatic. The reefs are our most biodiverse marine system, but they're also hugely important for millions of humans and animals around the world, and that includes turtles. And some species, particularly the hawksbill turtle, is very reliant on the reefs. It's a spongivore, and so that's where it's found. But other species also utilize these habitats. So I wanted to just start by hopefully just refreshing your mind, but those of you that may not know everything about turtles, hopefully you will learn something here about the life cycle. So going from the top here, when hatchlings emerge from the nesting beach, they go through this kind of frenzied period of behavior. They're like little clockwork wind-up toys, and they charge down the beach and they swim offshore for about the first 48 hours. And that's aimed to get them right offshore into the ocean currents that are moving around. And from there, they just feed on anything and everything that they can eat. And normally in an ideal world, that would be natural material. But of course, there's more and more man-made plastic and other debris out there that they consume. So that's quite a challenge. From that point, they kind of float around with the currents until they reach a size of somewhere, people talk about a dinner plate size typically for some species. And I've put here, this is kind of between 3 and 20 years, which is a huge range clearly. But for some species, the leatherback turtle in particular, they'll remain in the pelagic environment out at sea for most of their life cycle, only coming in shore to mate and nest. For other species, so pictured here, we've got a picture of the green turtle moving down to the right-hand side of this slide. Once they start to specialize in their diet, they'll move into a particular habitat. So for green turtles, that's seagrass. So the green turtles will move into the sort of coastal or neritic habitats where they'll forage. And from here they'll grow, and once they reach sexual maturity, they'll migrate to the mating grounds, which are typically offshore from the nesting beaches. Here they'll mate sometimes with many different males, hence the picture here. Females can then store sperm and produce a clutch of eggs around about 100 every 10 to 15 days over the breeding season. So that means that eventually they may lay somewhere between 3 and 6 clutches typically. We know some will lay up to 10. That migration to the nesting beach happens typically every 2 to 3 years for females, but some females will migrate every year, but it's a rarity. The eggs will then incubate in the sand for somewhere between 40 to 70 days, and this is temperature dependent, so it speeds up as temperature increases before hatchlings emerge. And so there are several reasons why turtles are pretty vulnerable to climate change. One of those is they're reptiles, so temperature is really important for all stages of development and growth. But actually also that means that they respond well to temperature because they're driven by temperature. So that might actually work in their favor. But in the early phases of development, they're very reliant on ocean currents, and actually through navigation and orientation, they utilize the currents throughout their lives. They're very long-lived, which means that being able to adapt to changes might not happen quickly enough in evolutionary terms at the pace we're going with the changes to climate. They have site fidelity, so they show quite strong fidelity to foraging locations as well as nesting locations. So that means that they start to become tied to sort of fixed resources and how those resources change and how they change. And if they are changing at different rates, that becomes a challenge. They also have natal phylopatry, and that means that they're returning to the beach or the coastal region, at least from where they themselves hatched, to breed themselves when they're adults. So you can imagine how that may have changed over the 20 to 30 years it's taken them to reach adulthood. But one of the big things about turtles that I think is really fascinating is that they have what's known as temperature-dependent sex determination. So the sex of their offspring is not determined genetically, it's determined by temperature. The reason for this is not very clear. We can't find a good explanation in turtles, but we have to assume that evolutionary wise, it's best to be a certain gender depending on the temperature or the environment in which you hatch into. So there has to be an advantage to being a male when it's cold or a female when it's hot. And that's the system that turtles have. So if you look at this graph on the right, you can see that, and this is proportion of female on the y-axis and temperature on the x-axis. As temperature increases, we get more and more females produced until we have 100% female. And that's typically somewhere between 25 to 35 degrees centigrade. So at 25 degrees centigrade, we'll have all males being produced, and at 35 degrees centigrade, which is almost reaching the critical point, to be honest, but 32 and above, it's typically 100% female. The point at which we get 50-50 sex ratio is something that we call the pivotal temperature, just for further reference. But we know that in freshwater turtles, many of them have genetic sex determination. Some have temperature-dependent sex determination, but some have genetic sex determination. Actually, some animals, and skinks are an example, have been found to have both temperature and genetic sex determination. And they seem to switch between those depending on the environment in which they live. I think that if we look more and more at turtles, marine turtles, we're going to find that actually they probably do have the ability to switch to genetic sex determination. And I think that would be fantastic to discover, clearly, but it also evolutionary wise, I think they probably have to have, to be able to survive for so long, I think we probably have to have both mechanisms in place at some point. The challenge we've got at the moment is that we cannot tell the sex of a turtle hatchling by looking at it. We have to actually look at its gonads and use histology to look at its gonads. And to do that, we have to euthanize, and so kill the hatchling in order to be able to look at that. So clearly, that is not always compatible with our conservation or research objectives. And so until that changes, we're kind of a little bit stuck and limited in what we can do. There are lots of people working on that, and I think we will have a breakthrough in the next few years to trying to look for, develop a marker that tells us what sex is. So once we get to the point that we can take a blood sample and say this is a male or female, this research area is going to open up massively, and I'm really excited about that. In sea turtles, the sex is determined during the mid-third of development. We don't know exactly when, we don't know the mechanism, we really don't know much about it, which is one of the fascinating things about turtles. Lots of fascinating things that we don't know the answers to, which is why they're interesting to study. But we do know that it happens during the middle third of incubation. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our work in Cyprus, and that's on loggerhead turtles. This is a little loggerhead hatchling pictured here. And just for a little bit of background, in Cyprus, we have both green and loggerhead turtles nesting. So loggerhead on the left, at the bottom left of your image, and the green turtle central. And you can see from this map that green turtles are focused in the Eastern Mediterranean, so nearly all in Turkey, Cyprus, and Syria. There's a little smattering of nesting also actually in Israel now. And roughly 10% of all loggerhead and 30% of green turtle nesting happens on the island of Cyprus, so it's an important site. It's also important for juveniles, lots of juveniles foraging around the area. And the graphs down on the right just give you a little indication of the numbers of clutches we're talking about that are laid in Cyprus, in North Cyprus particularly here, and the trend. So both of them going up, green turtles a little bit more so. So both seem to be doing okay, which is good news. And our research focuses at Alagadi Beach. So this is on the north coast of the island of Cyprus. And you can see these 4 bays really that are in front of you. And this is where we conduct our nighttime monitoring work. So since 1992, we've been monitoring individual females, tagging them and monitoring their nesting activity. And so nearly 30 years later, we've got some fantastic data on the life histories of these turtles. We've got turtles that are still nesting that we tagged back in 1992. So that's 30 years of breeding, which just gives you an indication of how long these animals may live for. Another question we don't know the answer to. So our aims were to sort of predict what the current sex ratios are that are produced at this site, and think about how these are impacted by future scenarios of climate change. Consider whether there's any evidence of adaptation, and whether phenological adaptation might mitigate any impacts. And by that I mean the seasonality of nesting. So whether the shift in the season into the cooler months might actually help this population adapt to the rising temperatures. And the graph on the right is showing you April sea surface temperature. So we're choosing April temperature here because this is typically the month that the turtles will arrive offshore and start to develop, mate and develop eggs. And you can see here that the black filled in dots are historic temperature and the white is predicted. So at this location, we anticipate and we predict that there will be in the region of 4 degrees centigrade rise by the year 2100. So that's quite a lot to cope with. To estimate offspring sex ratios, because we can't do it directly to look at the actual gonads, as I said, we do it using temperature. So we know the relationship at this study site of temperature and offspring sex. We've produced that curve. We've actually produced that curve from dead embryos that are collected at this site, but we have done these curves based on live offspring that have been euthanized at other sites. So we put a temperature logger into the nest. So this is a little yellow box here amongst the eggs. We do that when the female is laying her clutch so that we can keep the conditions as normal as possible. She then goes on to cover over her eggs, and once it hatches, we excavate the clutch, we retrieve the data logger. We also look at the remains of the clutch to estimate the number that hatched successfully. We don't have temperature loggers in every nest, so we need to do a little bit of extrapolation in order to estimate sex or estimate temperature, at least from those other clutches. And to do this, we use the relationship that exists, which is strong, between sea surface temperature and the clutch temperature. So that's our data on the right that we'll use, and then we will, from a known lay date, we can estimate when the middle third period of that incubation period was, and what the temperature of that clutch would have been. So we can then use that temperature to estimate what the sex ratio of that clutch would be. And so these are some of our data for loggerhead turtles from Malagasy. This is percentage female on the left. And you can see that the sex ratios produced here are extremely female biased. This is extreme even for sea turtles. And if you look at the graph or the figure on the right, you'll see that these are other rookeries of loggerhead turtles in the Mediterranean Sea, and black is the proportion of males and white, females, and white the proportion of males. So Cyprus is particularly skewed, but skewed sex ratios are the norm, and not just for the Mediterranean, but globally, female skewed sex ratios are the norm for marine turtles. So some of this work I've been doing with my colleague, Dr. Matthew Witt, also University of Exeter, who's pictured here. This is ongoing work that we are hoping to publish soon. So what we wanted to do was predict how future temperature change is going to impact the sex ratios of loggerhead turtles at this site. We are going into a vast amount of detail here, but it is here for those that would like to read. We basically ran a model that said if this clutch is laid on this particular day and it has an incubation period of 41, 48 or 66 days, which are our mean, min and max, when would the middle third period be? And what's the predicted temperature for that period using the predictive models, future forecast models? So we can say, okay, that clutch would have a sex ratio of X. And then because we know the seasonality of our nesting period, we can weight every day of the season and say, okay, on day 5 of the season, we usually get 5% of clutches laid, etc. So we can weight that curve and estimate what the sex ratio for that year would be for that population. It's also important to note that if the temperature falls at above 35 degrees centigrade, we assume no offspring are produced that the success of that clutch is 0. So this is what our predictions show. So on the left is the percentage of female, and on the right, the hatching success of clutches. And so you can see over time, unsurprisingly, we predict that with the rising temperatures, we get a more and more skewed sex ratio, reaching nearly 100% by 2100. But perhaps of greater concern is the decline in success of clutches over this time. And so hatching success is strongly related to temperature. And as we get towards, and back by 2130, we predict, if we extend that model, we predict 0 offspring produced at this site. So clearly that's quite a worrying scenario. Excuse me. But of course we want to see, is there any evidence of adaptation of this population? So when we actually look at the nesting and the onset of nesting, in this case on the left, I'm showing you the first day or the 5th percentile day of nesting. So we're just cutting off the extreme outlier tails of that seasonality. The season has advanced by 0.47 days a year over the study period. So the population does seem to be responding to these changes. One of the things that people always suggest is that turtles may change the depth at which they lay their clutch, because deeper clutches tend to be cooler. But our data on the right show that depth hasn't really changed significantly in one direction over the time period. So they don't seem to be adapting by shifting the depth of their clutches. But what we wanted to do then was run this advancement into our model. So we advanced our model by 0.5 days a year and estimated the sex ratio going forwards to see how these future scenarios might impact. And hopefully what you can see here is that for the percentage female, it still rises a bit, but it's kind of flattened out. Hatching success is still declining a bit, but not to the amount that we had imagined. We tried to sort of find the magic number, and that seems to be about 0.6 a day of a year. So this suggests that if the turtles up it a little bit to advancing the season by 0.6 days a year, they seem to reduce the impact on sex ratio, but also on hatching success. So this seems to be the ideal scenario. So hopefully that's illustrated that with this shifting of the season, or this phenological adaptation, this population does seem to be mitigating the impacts of temperature at the moment. But of course, there's only so far you can shift your season. There's only so many cooler months. Eventually, you may well run out. And actually, the population in Cyprus is quite fortunate because there's really quite a lot of seasonality in the Mediterranean if you compare it to the tropics, for example. And so there are months these populations can shift into, but for populations in the tropics and around the equator, that might not be quite so easy to do. But one of the things we were obviously concerned about is if there were so few males being produced at our population, actually, is this a problem for this population? And I'm switching here to green turtles because we chose to do this particular study on green turtles because they have much higher fidelity and our recapture rate was much better for females. And we wanted to look at repeat clutches of individual females. But green turtles at this site, so this is also in Cyprus, similarly have skewed sex ratios of 90 to 95% female typically. So this work was undertaken by Lucy Wright, who was a PhD student, and so she looked at the multiple paternity, or the paternity of clutches. To do this, then we take tissue samples from the nesting female and from her offspring. We identify and we reconstruct the profile for males, and then we can look at the prevalence of the males in the population that are contributing to offspring at this site. So we were really surprised to find that there were actually more males than females in this population, which was really a surprise. I anticipated there would be very few males and they'd be mating with all of the females in this population, just hanging off the nesting beach and grabbing every opportunity. We also thought perhaps that males were breeding annually. So if remember that females may only breed every 2 or 3 years at this site, but actually if males were coming annually, then that would offset this female bias sex ratio. It doesn't really matter then if you only have a third as many males as females. But actually we found we had 1.3 males to every female contributing to offspring. Males were not breeding annually, and also we were recording multiple paternity in clutches of 24% of our females, but no males side offspring from more than one female, which was a real surprise because we expected males to be contributing to the clutches of more than one female. And this pictured here is Robin Snape, who's a research fellow out in Cyprus, and he took this opportunity one night where this male green turtle came up on the back of this nesting female, which is very unusual and not something you'd expect to see. It's actually very difficult to get your hands on a male turtle. They never come on shore, I say never, except for this one. This has happened a few times actually. There's a few individuals that have done this over the years, but it's still quite a rare occurrence. Robin took the opportunity to put a satellite transmitter on this male just so we could sort of see where he was going and what he was up to. And this produced some insights into what might be going on in the system and what the mating strategy might be. So this map here shows you the route of this male. And so he starts off at A, where he's captured on the left and a transmitter is put on. He then moves up to location B on the Karpaz Peninsula, the Panhandle, where there's another large green turtle nesting beach, before tootling off to Turkey. C and D are both green turtle nesting rookeries, and then heading off when he's finished his business to his foraging ground in Egypt actually, and Lake Bardua, which we'll feature a bit later as well. So it seems to us then what this male and potentially others in the population are doing is actually hedging their bets and visiting lots of different rookeries, not hanging around off one nesting beach, but actually visiting many and contributing to offspring at different sites. And this is seen when we start to look at the genetics of these populations, and there appears to be more male-mediated gene flow in green turtles, so that would support this theory. So if males are travelling around and contributing to lots of rookeries, then perhaps that makes sense that we don't need quite so many of them as females. So I'm going to move on to another location. So this is the location of Ascension Island, about as far away from anything as you can get. Ascension is a UK overseas territory, and we've been working there since 1998 with the Ascension Island government. Also, these three researchers that are involved in the project, Sam Webber, Nicola Webber and Dominic Tilley, that are pictured here. And Ascension's a strange place. So the Marines established a garrison there in 1815 when Napoleon was exiled on St. Helena. And that was in case there was a rescue mounted. It seemed like a good location to be based. It then became a really important communications hub, and so has had RAF and US Air Force base there. The BBC has a relay station there. GCHQ and the space agencies have all worked there. Excuse me. We also have really nice connections between Ascension and Cornwall, because the first transatlantic communications cables went from Porthcurno in Cornwall to South Africa, and then via Ascension to the Caribbean. So some nice connections. It's an interesting island. It's a volcanic island, but the top of the island, known as Green Mountain, is a relatively recently established rainforest. That was, most of the plants were brought over from Kew Gardens a long time ago. And it's got some beautiful sandy beaches like this one. This is Long Beach, the main nesting beach, which is only about 1 kilometre long, but has a lot of turtles nesting on it. And it is located close to the main settlement of Georgetown, pictured in the distance. What was really interesting about Ascension Island is that the harvest of turtles was really important. This was one of the few sources of food that was available to those that were living on the island, but also for passing ships. So ships would come, call in on Ascension, and they would be stocked up with turtles. The turtles would have been flipped over, so it was all nesting females, flipped over onto their backs when they were nesting. Actually, they had the foresight to let them lay their eggs before they flipped them over. Stored in created turtle ponds, and then when ships came along, they could fill up their hulls with turtles, and they would be alive, so it's basically fresh meat for their journeys wherever they were going, whether they were on patrol in the South Atlantic, or whether they were going back to the UK. And it was very popular to stock up to take turtles for turtle soup for the Lords of the Admiralty. And the great thing about the Marines who ran this whole sort of process was that they kept fantastic records. So I, with the aid of a few others, went through the Admiralty records to try to create a profile of how many turtles had been harvested over the past. And so you can see from this graph that in some years, so in 1845, when we had the peak, we had more than 1,500 females were captured. And the decline here is a true decline, because in the records they write that there's no longer enough turtles nesting to warrant the employment of 2 men to turn the turtles at night. And they reached out to beaches further and further away from the settlement at Georgetown to take turtles from other beaches. And by the 1930s, when the American Air Force Base was established, turtle soup had kind of gone off the menu a little bit. It wasn't so popular. And so that died out. And the last record that we know of was of a turtle being taken in 1946. So since then, the island's been protected because it's so isolated. It's a fantastic place to go to lay your eggs, which is why these turtles make the massive trek from their adult foraging grounds in Brazil all the way to Ascension to lay their eggs. There's no food, there's no seagrass beds on Ascension, and they'll lay their clutches and then they'll make their migration back to Brazil. And it takes them from tracking them from Ascension Island to Brazil. We know that that journey itself takes about 6 weeks. It's a massive undertaking for them. And that's why they are actually the biggest green turtles in the world. And they're really quite big and fat when they arrive, and skinny and saggy when they leave. This is a graph just telling you how the population is today. So we've been involved in the monitoring since 1998, and you can see this population has been on the rise. And turtles are interesting because they're very long-lived. So they're a combination between R and a K selected species. They lay thousands of eggs potentially in one breeding year, but they're very long-lived, and the offspring are precocial and head off. And if conditions are right, the ability for a population to recover quite rapidly is there. So we now have in the region of 25,000 nests laid on Ascension Island in any given year, which equates to around about 15,000 females in the entire population. And our estimates from the harvest, that in order for that harvest to have been sustained, we estimate there must have been about 17,000 females in this population pre-harvest for that population not to have gone extinct. Potentially more, but at least 17,000. So we may be getting back to the realms of what the population was pre-harvest. And so one of the interesting things about Ascension Island is that it has these really white shell beaches that are produced. So on this graph, on this map of Ascension Island here, you can see LB. This is Long Beach that I was showing you a picture of before. And this is on the right is the color of the sand on Long Beach. And this other beach, which is NEB, which is Northeast Bay, is a dark volcanic sand. And what this means is that for the temperature of the sand and the incubation is about 2 degrees higher on Northeast Bay than it is on Long Beach. So of course that means that there's going to be more skewed sex ratios from Northeast Bay, but also the hatching success tends to be lower because it reaches much hotter temperatures. So we were really interested to see whether there might be some difference in eggs or females that were laying on these different locations, that they maybe provisioned their eggs or in some way had an adaptation, a local adaptation to these higher temperatures. To do this, we took eggs as they were being laid by females and placed them into incubators and monitored the incubation and looked at the hatching success. Oops, sorry, I jumped forward there. So this graph here kind of illustrates our findings. In this initial study we did, we had incubators at 29 degrees centigrade, which is the point at which we should have a 50-50 sex ratio. It's the pivotal temperature. And so when we incubated our clutches or in our incubators, we found we had really high, we had 100% success at 29 degrees centigrade. And that's for the 2 beaches. So the triangles are Hot Beach, Northeast Bay, and the circles are from eggs taken from Long Beach, from the cooler beach. But when we incubated eggs at 32.5 degrees centigrade, you can see there's a significant difference here between the success of these eggs. Those that were from the hotter beach did much better at this hotter incubation temperature. So this led us to think there's some kind of adaptation, and we did have studies ongoing which proved inconclusive, looking at the actual sort of contents of the eggs. But ultimately we wanted to do more and look at this more. So we went back with a view to repeating this experiment at a greater range of temperatures, but also looking at the actual sex of the offspring produced in these incubators. What we found was not what we'd hoped for. So we repeated the experiment. So we used a larger range of temperatures. You can see them on this graph. We used 26 to 33. We looked at the offspring sex ratios, and we looked at the hatching success. And we found no difference in either of those from these 2 beaches, from the white beach or the black beach. That was surprising because we had anticipated that we would at least replicate and find that the hatching success was different as we had in the first experiment. What we did find in this later study was that there was some variation among females in the sex ratios being produced. But it was only a kind of tantalizing glimpse in the data, not enough to really be conclusive. But what we'd really like to do is to carry on with this work to try to establish whether there are differences, whether some females actually have a different pivotal temperature. I think that probably that is the case, and we just haven't been able to do these studies on a large enough scale because of the limitations that I've already spoken about with determining sex. So that's all temperature and its effects on incubating eggs. Clearly a lot more to be learned, but we also want to consider other aspects of climate change and how it might be affecting the nesting beaches. And so this work has been conducted by Miguel Varela, who's pictured here with his drone, and he has developed a 3D modeling method using the drones to create 3D images of our nesting beaches. So we're back to Cyprus in this picture, and this is Loggerhead Beach here. And you can see it's a nice 3D image that's being produced. The sea is not grey there, it's just that it is greyed out in this image, as is the sky. But the blue just represents the methodology he uses with taking pictures with geo-reference locations, and it builds this wonderful model. It takes a very long time. So what we wanted to do was to kind of roll out scenarios of sea level rise and see what effect it would have on the nesting beach. On the left here, this is the 3D model, and on the right, this is the model with 0.48 meters of sea level rise. And as you can see, we start to lose not just areas close to the water, but low-lying areas. And these tend to be, in this image, riverbeds that exist in the winter that occasionally run. But these are low-lying areas of beach. And most sea level rise models previously, they literally just predict a sort of uniform encroachment. So it was great to be able to have these more detailed models. And as expected, as the scenario gets worse with 0.63 meters and then 1.2 meters, we're losing more and more habitat from the beach. Just to overlay the point at which we're losing 50% of our nesting habitat, and we've just used here the locations of nests over a 3-year period, which are shown in green dots, to show you where we're losing the habitat. So this is the point at 50% of nest loss occurs with this 0.68 meter rise. So this is clearly problematic for many populations, nesting populations, because although there may be the ability for the females to shift away from the sea, and they will move inland if there is habitat available, often there isn't habitat available because of developments and coastal developments in the areas, or because of the topography of the land. There's just nowhere for the sand to move to. What it does mean for us, we're fortunate that Loggerhead Beach does have areas that turtles will be able to move to. But But what it also means for us in the short term is that we can identify areas of beach which are particularly vulnerable. And what we have found over the last 3 or 4 years is that we're suddenly getting these really big storms in the middle of the nesting season that we never used to get before. It used to be very stable throughout the season. The weather was particularly dry and no rainfall in the summer months. But now we're getting these more and more. It seems to be more prevalent. And so that means that we have to be a little bit more active at moving clutches through the season. And so these models help us identify the vulnerable areas of the beach that we need to be relocating clutches from, so that they can hatch and not get washed away and destroyed. And lastly, I just want to talk to you a little bit about our satellite tracking work, because this is nesting females. So this is a nesting green turtle in Cyprus that Robin and another colleague is putting a transmitter on. We're very lucky actually in Cyprus, because the females will continue nesting whilst we're putting transmitters on them. We have got a box you can see pictured in the back there, which is just in case the female decides she wants to leave before the glue is dry on the unit. And so what we've sort of been seeing over time, and this is green turtles that I'm showing you here, is a kind of shift in what's happening with nesting females and their foraging grounds. So this figure is showing you the females that have been tracked from Cyprus, which is marked by the star, and the numbers in circles are telling you the number of individuals that have gone to these specific locations. And what we noticed, or this work was led by Phil Bradshaw, a PhD student, and what we noticed when we started to look at the stable isotopes from tissue samples of these individuals is that more and more of our turtles appear to be coming from this area off the coast of Egypt. So prior to 2015, we'd only had 2 individuals that had ever gone to this location. But the stable isotope analysis was telling us something different about the turtles that were coming to nest. So we specifically identified 5 individuals that had a particular isotopic signature, attached transmitters to them, and they all went to Lake Broderick in Egypt, which is has the number 7 on it over here on the right. Perhaps more interesting, more startling, is that we attached 19 more transmitters in 2018 and /2019 over the 2-year period, just to see whether we really are seeing a shift here. And of those 19, 14 moved to this area off Egypt. And just for a slightly closer look at where it is, this is this little inlet coastal area. So this is Lake Bardwell. And our turtles all seem to be coming in here and hanging out here. Quite whether this shift is related to climate change is a matter of debate, but certainly what we are seeing is a shift in where our turtles are foraging, what habitats they are utilising. Maybe just related to the good development conditions that they're finding there. Perhaps it's just fantastic foraging, but something is happening and something is shifting, and something for us to keep an eye on. We'd love to go to Lake Bardwell and do some research. It's a challenging place, Sinai at the moment, COVID apart, but we are collaborating or in contact with some Egyptian researchers who are doing some work out there. So it'd be really interesting to find out a bit more. So just to conclude, I hope that I've shown you this evening that turtles in Cyprus are responding to changing climate. We see a shift in phenology, and I think that offers some hope for the moment. But we're also starting to see changes in migration and foraging in this population. So we need to understand what's going on there a bit more. And of course, yes, this is just the nesting beach. This is just about offspring and nesting females. There's obviously it's a really important part of the life cycle, clearly. It's a fundamental part. But there's a huge area of research to be done looking at how climate is going to affect all the other stages of the life cycle, and particularly, as I said before, how shifting ocean currents, which are predicted to happen, is going to impact these kind of populations and species that migrate. So, final acknowledgement slide, just to acknowledge the collaborators and funders. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annette. That was absolutely fascinating. And what a wonderful set of organisms to be working on. They're absolutely fantastic. We have several questions, and I'm sure lots more will come in as people sort of recover from hearing all of that wonderfulness and think of the questions. Lots of people saying thank you. Hugh Jones asks, how can you show philopatry when it takes several years from hatching to maturity?
Genetic studies have really demonstrated that is the case, that these turtles are coming back to the same location. And actually some of the genetic studies that we've done in Cyprus with the green turtles, actually we can see the relatedness of individuals. So we've got grandmothers, mothers, and their cousins, and so that you can see this whole related network of individuals. Again, that is an area that we would really love to get some more money. So it's the mantra, get some more money to do more rigorous research. But the molecular techniques available now are just phenomenal. So, you know, to be able to actually see the relatedness of individuals and to then know, therefore, that they have all come back to the same location.
Great. The Coopers have said that in terrestrial turtles, the male has longer tails and a more caudal vertebrae than do females. And is this the case in sea turtles? And could you use that as a way of determining their gender without the need for any invasive techniques?
Yes, hello Coopers. Yes, as adults, there's a clear distinction. Males have a long tail and they have other distinguishing features, so they're easy to determine. But until sexual maturity, there are no obvious signs as to what a male or female is. So that's the challenge we have, is that it's only internally that we can determine sex until they've reached sexual maturity. There may be some other indicator we've missed that we might be able to pick up in future, but I think it's going to be a molecular method that we find out in future.
Yeah, that might be the easiest thing. Sophie asks, if you're putting one temperature logger in the nest in the middle, is it possible that would only give you the temperature in the middle of the nest and that the edges could be colder and therefore giving more males around the periphery than you might expect?
Yes, very good question. And yes, you're absolutely right. There's a range of temperatures within a clutch. So for these models, we're using the middle, but yes, the edges are varying in different temperatures, and also we have a lot of metabolic heating within the clutch from the developing embryos that also generates heat, which does have an effect. So yes, it's a relatively coarse measure, but for this scenario, it's the one that we chose to use, the middle.
Okay, so the Coopers again have asked, what's the state of local legislation in the countries that you work in, and does it help or hinder your conservation work?
Cyprus is an interesting one because clearly it's a divided country still, and so we have this very interesting situation in the north of Cyprus where it is part of the EU, but it doesn't necessarily have to follow all of the regulations. But what it does try to do is it's trying to align itself to EU legislation, let's say. So, you know, hopefully thinking forwards for the future. So actually it's pretty good actually for nesting beaches. We were very lucky that we got in to Cyprus early enough before massive tourism development happened, and we were able to identify the major nesting beaches, and they have been protected. So from that point of view, it's really good. What we need to do next and what we are working on is the marine environment, because there's very little control and regulations of the fisheries, and that's a major impact for the turtles as well at this site. Somewhere like Ascension Island, just to mention that quickly, it's a relatively closed island, so it's pretty well protected.
A long way away from any
Yes.
Ascension Island.
It is.
Someone, Alex Owens, has asked that he was in Malaysia for a field course, and egg poaching was a really big problem. And is this a problem in the Eastern Mediterranean?
No, it's not a problem in the Mediterranean. One of the places that turtles are eaten is actually Egypt and other North African areas that we know that does go on. But for most of the Mediterranean, that isn't a problem, and eggs are not taken. But in many countries, they are. And in many countries, actually, there are regulated egg harvests. In fact, in many countries, there are also regulated turtle harvests. And that's an interesting topic, I think, to consider. Some of the places that I've worked, eating turtles is probably the best thing you could do for the marine environment in question, if the other options are taking reef fish or, you know, or lots of other species. So when you weigh it all up, if people need to rely on a resource, and turtles are increasing in numbers, and it can actually be the sensible thing to eat. But of course, regulation is usually the massive challenge, and what is sustainable is the other big magic question.
Yeah, it is one of those $64,000 questions. So someone has asked, if the natal beaches become unavailable or unviable, what do you think might be the biggest contributor for a turtle for choosing or switching to a different nest location?
We do see this actually in places where the beaches have lost sand, and turtles will come and try. If they can't come onto a beach and they continually try to dig and they fail, they will just kind of move on and pop up along the coast, trying to find the next place. And there has to be quite a lot of adaptation in this mechanism, right? Otherwise they wouldn't still be here, because loss of habitat is not a new thing. Changing habitat might have happened quite dramatically, particularly in some of the areas of the Mediterranean, for example, in recent years. But the turtles are quite persistent. Although we do know that there are quite a lot of records of turtles dropping eggs at sea. So if they really can't find anywhere to deposit their eggs, they'll just drop them. But yeah, I mean, they'll keep going until they find somewhere. Just hopefully it isn't too far away.
Very persistent. There's a rather long question here about the kind of Convention on Migratory Species and concern about how climate change may be changing ranges of migratory species. And they're looking for guidance for the parties to think about what action parties in the convention might need to take. And he wondered if you had any thoughts about the extent to which the temperature-mediated sex ratios may mediate range shifts in these organisms.
That's quite a difficult question.
I know, it's quite complicated.
Well, so sex ratios aside, what we are seeing in the Mediterranean, which I didn't talk about because it's not my research, but research of others is showing that loggerhead turtles in particular seem to be spreading, and now we're getting nests recorded in Italy, Spain, France. Perhaps they were there historically, but the genetic analysis that has been done by one of my collaborators suggests that these are new founding stocks. So it does seem that they are shifting and finding new areas to nest. And that's likely just to be to do with warmer waters, making those areas more accessible to them. That will then mean, of course, that those populations that are more northerly may have a different sex ratio, perhaps more males, but are being produced at those sites, which could be a good thing. So as long as the turtles are responding to temperature and where they're going, then hopefully they will be in the right place for embryonic development, hopefully.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's a bit of a complicated balance between things. Alex Owens asked another question, could it ever be possible to use environmental engineering to reclaim beach habitat that gets lost to sea level rise, perhaps pontoons with sand on them off the coast? Or has anyone thought of doing that, or are we not at that state yet?
Yeah, I mean, there is one little beach in Cyprus that wasn't a beach and was made into a beach by a hotelier who fancied having a little beach for his guests, and turtles have started nesting there. So yeah, it's very possible. You know, they'll try anything. It's not great success, I'd have to say, but yes, certainly renourishing beaches is a big deal, especially in North America, where they lose a lot of habitat, and they're doing a lot of renourishing of beaches.
I'm going to take a question down here near the bottom. I think we're going to end up with more questions because people are putting them both in the Q&A and in the other box. So you don't agree with the prediction that the turtle populations will be wiped out in 50 years' time?
No.
I thought that would be a nice short answer. So do you just want to elaborate on that a little bit? Because you often do hear that turtles are hugely endangered and will be wiped out in very short order. So I mean, your research on Ascension surely shows that those populations are coming back.
Yes, but somewhere like Ascension actually is quite vulnerable because it's so isolated. So if our turtles in the Mediterranean, you can imagine they may shift, and they might make a sort of gradual shift northerly as temperatures rise. If they're staying in the Mediterranean, then they're gonna reach a point they can't shift anymore. The population on Ascension, if Ascension Island becomes unsuitable, they're going to have to find a completely new place to nest. And actually, in recent years, we've been seeing more and more nests laid on St. Helena, which is 700 miles south of Ascension Island. Quite why these turtles, people think that perhaps it's just because we're seeing an increase in numbers and they're just kind of getting a few more popping up in the wrong place, but they seem to be being successful. Turtles have been around for several 100 million years, and I think they're pretty resilient beasts. I think their ability to move through the oceans to find new places, there's no real barriers, perhaps other than the Mediterranean being a barrier to get out of. But for the global population, I think they will shift. I think we'll see local extinctions in different places, but I think we'll see new populations seeding further north.
Great. Well, that's a nice and very hopeful thing about turtles. Is Lorraine Aldridge asked, do you think climate change will have any impact on nesting behavior in terms of selecting vertical or horizontal position of nesting on particular sites?
Yeah, the one thing about the two study sites I've talked about today is that they're very barren beaches. That there's no shade, no vegetation, and what you do find in other locations, especially in the tropics, is that turtles may choose to nest amongst the vegetation, under bushes. There's a lot more variety of places that they can select, and the temperature in those locations then differs quite significantly. We don't see much variation across our study beaches at all in terms of temperature variation. But yes, females, definitely will be selecting the environment that they want for their offspring, and some may choose to go to shady, cooler locations.
Yeah, so there's a couple of we're running out of time, and I just want to kind of pull these together so that we can. There's a couple of questions about whether or not turtles would migrate to cooler climates to balance out the gender ratio, or that you'd have higher temperature, more females and less dispersal, and lower temperature, more males and more dispersal. So that's kind of this, not the same question, but they're sort of similar.
Yes, I think that yes, that's very possible. So we're probably gonna see quite different responses in the males and the females in terms of what they do and where they go. Females are the ones that have a strong natal phylopatry, so I think that's going to be quite different, as you saw, be it from that one individual male. Males can roam around a lot more freely.
So another question here is that, is there a change in lifespan of green turtles, and is there differences in vulnerability of disease dependent on temperature?
Lifespan, we don't really know, but what we do know, so for example, our loggerhead turtles in Cyprus are the smallest loggerhead turtles in the world, and we think that is a result of the very hot incubation environment they have. So it speeds up development, and what that tends to result in is a earlier maturity. So it tends to be not just the incubation environment that's speeded up, but it follows through into the life, and everything is speeded up as a result. So our turtles that are maturing in Cyprus are probably much younger than in other places. So yes, I think the temperature will affect lifespan effectively if they're remaining in that hot environment. But you'd hope that they would shift to the right environment, right temperature that they should be in, and not remain in the hot temperature. So the Eastern Mediterranean around Cyprus will likely become unsuitable for turtles to live in over time, because the waters will get too hot, and so they will shift. The seagrass beds may die, and so they will shift. And so I think all of those things will be pushing them further north. I can't remember the second part of that question now.
Don't worry. So following on from that, this is the penultimate question. Well, I'll riddle this in, is could we see turtles nesting in the UK by 2030? And do turtles use the Suez Canal?
Okay. Could we see turtles by 2030? I think that's too soon to hope for, but maybe eventually. We have turtles that are the leatherback turtle is part of our British summer fauna, comes into our waters, but that's because it's so big and it can survive in these northerly areas. But with time, yes, maybe, why not? The Suez Canal, we haven't had any evidence that we've had movement through the Suez, but of course, since it's been widened and doubled in width, we've seen a lot of species come through into the waters around Cyprus, and mostly fish. The fishermen complain about. So things like lionfish are now very common around Cyprus. No reason why not. I think we just have to record it. Yeah, maybe hawksbill turtle would be nice to pop in.
Keep watching.
Keep watching.
And
yeah.
the very last question of all is the one that you kind of talked about at the very, very beginning of your talk. Is several people have asked, how do I get involved? Is it better to go in the field? How can one get involved in turtle research?
There's lots of opportunities for people to volunteer. I think turtle projects around the world. It's certainly our project out in Cyprus. Lots of volunteers go out there every year. Yeah, I think you just got to get out there and volunteer, get involved. Lots to be done. Lots of manpower needed. Fantastic opportunity. Fascinating
organisms. And thank you so much, Annette, for an absolutely wonderful talk. And everyone is just, the chat is full of thank you, excellent presentation. So thank you so much for joining us and talking to us this evening. And thanks everyone for coming to the Linnean Society. And fellows, please don't forget to vote in the fellows area of the website. It's open till midnight. Be there or be square. So thank you everybody for coming, and we'll see you at the next lecture from the Linnean Society of London. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good night.